after this teletown hall. So you have all the information will come in our newsletter. Again, hit #6 if you want to get on that. Our phone number to our headquarters in Detroit is 313-961-4330. Again, 313-961-4330. So they're going to help you handle those cases and advocate on your behalf. Beyond casework, I think it's really important that I do my best to show up everywhere in Michigan, every corner of our state, all 83 counties, but I'm just one person. So the way that we're organized in the state of Michigan is I have a regional representative in every region of the state of Michigan. That's 8 people who divide up the state, and they're boots on the ground. They live in the community, and when I can't be at a community event, or when they need to, you need me to hear what's going on in the community, and you want to have a group meeting, but I'm in Washington, these are the folks that you can reach out to. And again, in our newsletter, we'll put the information for our regional folks so that you can reach out to the folks. If you live in Alpena, who do you reach out to? If you live in the UP, if you live in Grand Rapids or Detroit. Thirdly, the way that obviously I work on your behalf is by legislating, right? By passing legislation, voting on legislation, and passing appropriations, money, the power of the purse. So you have my commitment, especially in a state like Michigan, where we're very politically mixed, that I'm going to be straight with you on how I'm going to vote. So you should feel very free to reach out, give us your opinions, say, yes, you should vote on that bill. No, you shouldn't vote on that bill. Your voice really matters in this conversation. Let me give you an example of how much engagement we get every single week. Last week, between email and regular snail mail, we got 58,000 pieces of mail or emails, and we got 13,000 phone calls, just pushing and pulling on what legislation I should or shouldn't vote on or think about. So I encourage you to do that and be engaged. In terms of my legislative priorities, it's important that you know what my priorities are as I legislate here in Washington. So I'll just very quickly go through the 4 things that I spend most of my time on. Number 1, by far, like my sun and my moon, is expanding and protecting the middle class. I'm a big believer that the middle class is the anchor of American society. We need it as a democracy to survive. Everyone should be able to do well, work one job with good benefits, and then have their kids do better than them. That's the American dream. So bringing down the costs of the big things you spend your money on, your health care, your child care, your daily grocery costs, that's what I spend most of my time doing. Number 2 is bringing supply chains home, right? Michigan's a manufacturing state. We've outsourced a lot of our supply chains abroad, and chickens really came home to roost during COVID. So I'm constantly obsessed with legislating and talking about bringing our supply chains back home because I think it's so important for our economic security. Number 3 is protecting our kids from the things that are truly harming them. So I'm a national security person by training, a former CIA officer and Pentagon official. So I think about national security and being a strong leader in the world so that we are safe back home, but also protecting our kids in our communities, right? Those are things I spend a lot of time on. And then lastly, protecting our rights and our democracy, right? I think they're part of who we are as Americans. So I will always stand up for our rights and our democracy. So those are my 4 priorities. Okay, I'm going to give a little update, a little briefing like I used to do when I was a CIA officer on just what's happening in Washington, because I know that it feels like every day there's a ton of new information. It's hard to process. I know a lot of people who have just kind of tuned out and have said, you know what, I'm not going to watch the news. I'm not going to even try and follow it. I know a lot of people who are obsessed with watching the news. So I just thought I'd give you an update from my perspective on what's truly happening. I'll give you an update on something that's very pressing, the US government funding deadline, which is tomorrow, which is why I'm still here in DC. Number 2, Elon Musk and the Doge cuts that are going on, how that affects Michigan, how that affects us as a nation, what the impact is. Number 3, the proposed President Trump's proposed domestic agenda, what we can expect, particularly out of tax cuts. And then just a quick hit on the big updates of what's happening abroad in national security that I know resonate with a lot of Michiganders who are from, lots of different countries across the world. Okay, so let's get into it here. Let me say at the top, I think we had a very big signal in our last election that Michiganders and Americans want change, right? They wanted the government to be more responsive to them. They wanted more money in their pockets and not being spent out on the economy. And I think we need to hear that message. And as someone who won on the same ticket as Donald Trump, I think Michiganders expect me to be straight on these issues. I think change in the government, cutting fat in the government, is something that both Democrats and Republicans can agree on. I just think there is a responsible way to do that and a reckless way to do that. So here's some of the things that are going on in Washington right now. The government funding deadline. Let's start with that. Last year, Congress passed a stopgap measure to keep the government open, keep it from shutting down completely every single part of the federal government. That agreement expires tomorrow, Friday, tomorrow. On Tuesday of this week, the US Congress voted on a continuing resolution to fund the government, keep it open for another 6 months. We're in kind of this pattern of approving a short-term budget, not the full year budget that we're used to be doing. That vote is tomorrow morning. And I just want to say here that I will be voting no on that continuing resolution. When you look at that bill that's coming out tomorrow, it's not good for Michigan. It has major cuts to some of our big infrastructure projects that we have going on, including things like the SULOCs. It has big cuts to the VA and service for our veterans. And it really harms a lot of the programs aimed at the Great Lakes, along with a bunch of other things. But on top of that, I really wanted some assurances going into this conversation on the budget that however the money was appropriated, it was going to be spent as directed, right? That we weren't going to have Mr. Musk and his team come in and decide that the money was just going to go in a different direction. And so far, I have not seen any of those assurances. So until and unless I get some sort of clarity, I'm going to be voting no on that continuing resolution tomorrow. I'm a former federal government employee. I don't like shutdowns, but I think that we need to have an honest bipartisan conversation. Adults can get in the room and negotiate on these things so that we have some assurances that the money we put out in our bill is going to be spent accordingly. So that's tomorrow morning, or tomorrow afternoon, I should say, that vote tomorrow. So to be continued on what's going to happen. It's I think, potentially a nail biter tomorrow. So we'll all wait for that. Let me just talk about some of the DOGE cuts that have been happening and how they affect Michigan in particular. We all know that Mr. Musk was brought in, and the young people working with him were brought in to look at the federal government and start making cuts. It's a very hot topic in Michigan, and I know this because we've received 20,000 individual calls, emails, and letters about it. So it's been a very hot topic of conversation, both for and against. And as I said, I believe we can cut waste in the government. I worked at the Department of Defense. I worked at the CIA. I know there's fat on the bone. If you would have given me the task of cutting it, I could tell you exactly where I'd start. But I do think there's a responsible way and a reckless way, and a way that doesn't have to harm our state and harm our security. A couple of things just in terms of actual numbers. The cuts to DOGE have cut hundreds of federal government employees in the state of Michigan. These are folks who are working for the VA, in our hospitals, in our VA outreach programs, the National Park Service Rangers, a number of folks from the Department of Agriculture, a number of folks from NOAA, the folks who do the weather predictions. We've been hearing a lot about this from people who like to get their weather. So we have seen hundreds of people let go. Most of those people were either very new employees, or in some cases they were very new into a new job. We unfortunately saw a number of supervisors who were fired because they happened to be newly in their supervisory role. They may have been with the agency for 15 years, but they were new into that role and they were let go. And we're starting to see some effects on the ground in Michigan. I think certainly heading into the spring and summer, as Michiganders try and access some of our places of natural heritage, there's a lot of open questions about whether all the services at our parks and our forests are going to be open, whether trails are going to be kept up. Obviously, we're already concerned about weather and predicting the weather for all our boaters. We are concerned, obviously, about service to our veterans, particularly those who help in mental health services. So we are watching these very closely and trying to claw back where we can the people we think are truly essential to making Michigan, the place we've come to rely on as a place that likes to take care of people who are just good citizens. The other thing that we're watching is very closely is the collection of our private data. Mr. Musk has been accessing taxpayer data through the Treasury. He's been accessing health benefit data through Medicaid and Medicare information. We're concerned about him getting access to veterans information, Department of Defense sensitive information. His team has been open that they are looking to consolidate that information in kind of the cloud. We don't know what he is doing with that information, whether it's protected from cyber attack. So that's something we've spent a lot of time here, and I have a number of pieces of legislation that we're pushing to make sure that no one gets access to our sensitive classified information who isn't someone who's confirmed and someone who's authorized and has had appropriate background checks before they touch that personal information, which is very standard. So we're concerned about that. We also have a lot of cuts to funding that are looming on the table, particularly to our big institutions. So University of Michigan, for instance, I did a breakfast with Michigan alumni yesterday. University of Michigan is the third highest recipient of research dollars from the National Institutes of Health. Think cancer research, think Alzheimer's research, think research on the new drugs that we want to discover here in the United States. We are very concerned about the cuts that are happening in research, not just because we don't want researchers to lose their jobs, but because the science coming out of our institutions is important for all of us as a country and as a culture. And if we don't do that groundbreaking research, right, if we're not the leaders in that research, we know who's nipping at our heels, and that's a place like China, right? And I feel very strongly that I would rather have University of Michigan discovering that next life-saving drug, vetting it, testing it, putting it through rigorous discussion and debate, than having some other competitor in another country do that same work, and then we're dependent on the drugs that they produce. So there's been a bunch of cuts, particularly related to agriculture, related to science, that have gone on in our state that, again, we are trying to push back and claw back. But these cuts are definitely impacting Michigan and will continue to impact Michigan, and the public will feel the effects of that. Let me turn now to the other parts of the domestic agenda that President Trump has started to lay out for the American people. I think it's important to understand why the president is looking for money, why he's looking for cuts in every corner of the federal government. He is looking for approximately $6 trillion based on his numbers and his plans that he's put out, so that he can do a number of things, but including pay for a very big tax cut that he wants to continue here this spring. You're going to start to hear a lot of information about taxes in the next couple of months, but he is looking to create big tax cuts for some of the wealthiest in the United States and for our corporations. And in order to do that, he has to find places to cut. So that's why he's looking in the couch cushions, trying to find these different corners and pockets of money so that he can cut and turn it around into a tax cut. One of the things, therefore, that we are watching is when these bills come out on his tax policy, because it affects every American, right? It doesn't matter where you are and how much money you make. Tax policy affects all of us, and we all feel that right now as we hurry up to do our taxes for this year. That's the next big thing I want everyone kind of focused on, is these specific proposals, who they benefit, who they don't benefit, and how that will affect you personally. In the meantime, the president has been talking a lot about tariffs, right? I'm sure you've heard this kind of on again, off again, will he, won't he on tariffs. And I just want to make clear, tariffs are not necessarily a bad tool, right? They're a tool in the toolkit. And certainly when it comes to places like China and putting tariffs on China, there's, I think, bipartisan support for looking at that, given the way China cheats in our economic system. But we've been trying to follow this story, particularly on tariffs on Canadian products, right? And on our relationship, our trade relationship with Canada. Obviously, the border states, the northern border states, are most impacted by the tariff threat with Canada. Michigan is probably the single most affected state in the country because we're a manufacturing state and we do a lot of things like build cars with parts that come from Canada. We assemble cars in Canada, then we move it over to the United States. We've got cars and car parts going across that border, our bridges and tunnel, all the time. And now they would be potentially subject to tariffs. Our farmers, the single biggest market for Michigan farmers in the whole world is the Canadian marketplace. So our farmers have already been in my office talking about the concerns they have about how they're going to lose market share, how they're going to lose money, how they're not going to be able to sell to the Canadians because of retaliatory tariffs. So we're going back and forth. The president has imposed already 25% tariffs on all steel and aluminum. So you can imagine making a car, right? Steel and aluminum are a big part of making a car. So already we're in the territory of having the price of a car go up. And now in response, lots of other countries are coming back and they say, well, if you're going to put a tariff on, your goods, we're going to put a tariff on your goods, and starting a little bit of a trade war. It seems like every other day they're on or they're off. It's kind of like the hokey pokey, like we're going in and going out. But what I am concerned about is the prices of important things to American families could legitimately go up. I'm deeply concerned about things like the cost of lumber and construction materials. We could see home prices go up potentially $20,000 because of those tariffs. I'm concerned about the price of groceries, right? Eggs are already astronomical, but milk and bread, butter, other things. And then on cars, so many Michiganders understand the car industry. We're concerned that the price of a vehicle could go up between $3,000 and $12,000 for a new car, depending on what car it is. And we all know that when the price of a new car goes up, people buy less cars. And we don't like that in Michigan. We like when people are really buying cars. So we're watching the tariff conversation very closely. The instability because of the tariffs is creating instability in the stock market. And while not a lot of people are maybe like big stock traders and involved in the stock market, many people in Michigan have 401ks, they have retirement accounts, they have pension accounts, they have things that depend on the up and down of the stock market. And we've seen some pretty dramatic drops in the stock market. And that's because they don't know what's happening with the tariffs and they don't know whether a trade war is coming. And we're hearing more and more people, flag as a risk a potential recession, right? A self-inflicted recession, and nobody wants that. That is bad for everybody. Okay, the tax plan that I flagged for you that the president is going to bring forward here, he's going to do it through this pretty wonky process called reconciliation. You don't have to know what that means. You just have to know that in the next month or two, he's going to come up with his plan. And he's going to be looking, like I said, for the $6 trillion. The fact of the matter is the math doesn't work very well without looking at big programs, expensive programs, things that most Americans rely on in some form or fashion. So the first one I'm very concerned about is Medicaid. For those who don't know, Medicaid is a healthcare system that a lot of people in Michigan depend on. More than 2.5 million people out of our 10 million Michiganders are benefit from Medicaid. And that includes 280,000 children who get their health care through Medicaid. I also want to flag the one that I would just put on your radar is nursing homes. Over 60% of Michigan's nursing homes are funded through Medicaid, or at least funded in part through Medicaid. So we're starting to get our nursing home leaders coming forward and saying, hey, if they actually go after Medicaid, we're concerned about keeping our nursing homes open, right? We've got lots of people's parents and grandparents. So we are very concerned about those cuts and fighting back against those cuts. We also are starting to hear people say out loud now that they're going to have to look, particularly Elon Musk, we're going to have to look at your quote entitlements. And what's meant by entitlements, Social Security and Medicare. That's what those entitlements are. I don't like the word entitlements because you actually worked for your Social Security and for your Medicare. They're not a gift to you. You paid into them as working people so that you have a more secure retirement. And last week, Mr. Musk did say for the first time that we're going to have to look at those entitlement programs. We're going to have to look at fraud in those entitlement programs. Fraud is one thing, but major cuts to those programs would affect so many Michiganders, so many people around the country. Again, I am a big believer that we need to preserve and expand the middle class. Cutting Medicare, Social Security does not do that. Cutting Medicaid does not do that. Okay, very quickly, just lastly on national security, because we have so many Michiganders who they are from another country or their families are from another country. Let me just say a quick word about a couple of issues that people really care about. First is the war in Ukraine, Russia and Ukraine. Right now, the US and Ukraine have agreed to a 30-day ceasefire. That was agreed to on Tuesday. But now we got to get Russia to agree to a 30-day ceasefire. Because the US and Ukraine have agreed, President Trump has thankfully released intelligence sharing between the US and Ukraine. So again, we're talking to each other about classified information. Our intelligence analysts are sharing data and information. So that's a good thing. But now the Trump administration is trying to get the Russians to agree to a ceasefire proposal. And the Russians are being difficult, as most can predict. President Putin seems to have some pretty out there demands on what he wants for that ceasefire. But right now, that is the negotiation that are happening. A lot of those negotiations are happening in Saudi Arabia to try and get to that ceasefire agreement. In the meantime, the President Trump has put his thumb on the scale pretty significantly for Putin. We differ on how to approach that issue, but we're watching negotiations as they go on. And then lastly, because we have so many people in Michigan who care about what's going on in the Middle East, we still have a temporary pause in the fighting between Israel and the Palestinians in Gaza, between other states in the region, Lebanon, Yemen, that is holding as hostages are in exchange. But there's still pretty sensitive negotiations going on how do you go from a temporary pause to something more permanent. And in the meantime, Israel has certainly stepped up pressure to try and heat up these negotiations on the Palestinians and on life in Gaza, and in ways that are making it difficult for people in Gaza. But we're hoping that the negotiations going on in Qatar actually bring us not just from this temporary to something more permanent, so we can get to the point of rebuilding. Okay, last thing, people are always calling our office saying, how can we get engaged? How can we, what should we do if we care about an issue? Like what's kind of the way to go? And I would just say the things you should be watching are legislation. We talked about watching what we vote on here in the Senate, what we vote on in the House, keeping your legislators accountable by engaging them and telling them, vote for this or don't vote for that for this reason. Calling our offices, emailing our offices. I get literally, it's every other day, a report on like how many have called on this bill, how many are for, how many are against, what are the arguments for and against that bill. We take meetings with people who want to engage us on a specific bill. So please engage me and engage your other elected representatives. That's what we do. Number two is litigation. A lot of the things that are like really scratchy right now coming out of Washington are being litigated in the courts, right? Big constitutional issues. There's hundreds of court cases going on across the country, thousands of lawyers participating in this. You can find a tracker of all the litigation at an organization called justsecurity.org. And it just kind of gives you an update on all the federal cases. So if there's something you're particularly interested in, you can follow. Communication, you should be active. We all know that media is changing, and some people still watch local news or they watch the cable news, but a lot of people, especially younger people, are on social media. We got to communicate and talk about issues that we care about. We can't just sit in our screens and doom scroll and not kind of push for the things we care about. So those are the things I recommend. Thank you for staying on this long. Thank you for picking up the phone. Please press *3 if you want to ask a live question. Press *6 if you want to get on our list for our newsletter, so you know the comings and goings, the legislation, what's happening in Congress. And Alexa, over to you.
Okay, great. So we are going to take some live questions. If I am going to take your question, I will say your name, and then you'll hear a little sound, and then you can say your question directly to the senator. So we have Crystal Ann from Ann Arbor, who wants to know what the Democrats are doing in response to Elon Musk. Go ahead, Crystal. Shoot, I'm sorry. I guess we lost her. That's okay. I guess if you want to go ahead and address the question,
Sure.
What are the Democrats doing to try to fight against Elon Musk and his role in Trump's government?
Yeah. So again, it's really kind of what I outlined: legislation, litigation, and messaging. On legislation, there are a number of bills that have been proposed, a number of amendments to bills that have been proposed that are trying to say, hey, if you're going to be part of Doge and part of this team, whether you're 20 years old or you're Elon Musk, you have to have gone through the same security vetting that any other government employee would have to go through. You're going to have to, be subject to a background investigation. You're going to have to turn in financial disclosure forms, right? That's something we all do. I do as a senator. Just live up to the basic standards of a federal government employee, especially if you're going to have access to people's sensitive information. Then there's sort of a whole raft of constitutional issues. Can someone come in? It's one thing to let very new employees go, but what about employees who have been there for 15 years, who have stellar records? It's not for cause. They're not new employees. There's a lot of lawsuits that are going on right now. And again, I refer you back to the justsecurity.org tracker to follow that. And then there's messaging. I think there's quite a bit of concern from Democrats, Republicans, and independents about what Mr. Musk is doing, and kind of like firing people on a Friday and then rehiring them on a Monday, and getting rid of people who work for the FAA and do flight safety work, getting rid of people who do safety work on our railroads for carrying that sort of sensitive chemicals and freight. So I think getting that message out and having bigger and bigger groups of people advocate, both in person but also online, is something that I've seen people do in a big way to advocate for their community. So litigation, legislation, and communication.
Okay, let's try again with a live question. So this time I'm going to go to Lauren from East Lansing. Lauren, go ahead and ask your question.
Hello, thank you for taking my question. I just wanted to get a little, I guess, going off of the last question, clarity on what Elon Musk's role is within the government and what authority he has within the government, because it seems like there's been some pretty massive decisions that are being made. And I contacted my rep as well and got a response that he's a senior advisor, but he's not an administrator of Doge, and nor is he technically a part of it, but that doesn't really answer my question. So I'm hoping you can provide some clarity. Thank you.
Yeah, well, I'll provide as much clarity as I have, which is not a ton. But originally, we were told that Mr. Musk and his group were becoming what is called an SGE, a special government employee, right? These are kind of HR terms where you can bring people in, experts into the government for a short-term basis to do some specific work. So for instance, if you need to bring in a nuclear scientist to work on a specific program at the Department of Defense, you can bring them in for 4 months under this SGE, special government employee. That's what we were told at first. Now it's changed, and they've taken Mr. Musk out of that status. And now I guess he's just an advisor to the president, We don't know exactly why he did that. Maybe it was because of all the litigation that's been coming up. I really don't know. But this is why there are now so many active court cases, including cases that are being led by the Attorney General of Michigan, Dana Nessel. Our attorneys general around the country have legal standing to launch these cases, and many of them are about Mr. Musk and his role of being able to make these critical decisions that affect our national security and our economic security. So all I can tell you is what I've been told, which is he was a special government employee. Now he's not. He's an advisor. And his ability to make these major decisions and cuts is being challenged. And my guess, it will work its way through the courts, potentially to the Supreme Court, because of how controversial it's been. So your confusion is warranted.
Okay, we are going to go to Clint next, who has a question about trade. Go ahead, Clint.
Thank you for taking my call. I appreciate the update that we received tonight. I'm concerned about the economic warfare that has been declared against our allies. What can the Senate do to rectify that? It's going to kill the auto industry.
Yeah, this is one of those things. I mean, it's interesting. Tariffs, in Michigan, people understand. I was pumping gas the other day, and I was pumping gas next to people who I could tell from the stickers on their car they were supporters of President Trump and still very supportive of President Trump. But they said, but you know what, I don't like this yo-yo back and forth on the tariffs because I think it's going to hurt Michigan. And I think that's people are starting to understand that we are uniquely positioned to be impacted as the state of Michigan by tariffs. And right now, the big project is to keep the sort of, the president has been sort of using threatening language and saying he's about to do these tariffs, but then pulling them back, saying he's about to do them, but pulling them back. That pulling of them back is because he's being pressured by a whole range of people, certainly U.S. senators and representatives, but also the business industry, or the business leaders, right? You can imagine what it's like if you run an auto parts company and what it might do to your business. You can imagine, the Farm Bureau has put out some very strong statements about what tariffs would do to farmers. So it's a pressure campaign, if I can be honest, to get the president to maybe tailor and think more thoroughly through a plan, and to not treat a country like Canada like we would China, right? I think Michiganders, we can have our rivalries occasionally with the Canadians, but we understand that China and Canada aren't the same thing. So it's a pressure campaign right now. And if the president continues and sort of follows through with his threats, because you can't do that forever. You can't threaten and then not do it, and threaten and not do it, and have it continue to work. If he goes so far as to lay down these tariffs as he's threatened, I think the Senate does have the ability to go after him through legislation. But then I think, unfortunately, we're going to start to feel the prices, and then the public is going to start to question this in a much bigger way. Right now, Michigan's very attuned to this. Other states are not as attuned to tariffs. They're not as dependent on trade. They're not a northern border state. So public pressure also really matters in this moment. We just got to be really clear and objective. You don't have to be political about it. Just objective on what tariffs is going to do to your industry, your jobs, your small business. So it's a combination of pressure, legislation, and public sentiment.
Okay, we are going to go next to Karen from Ferndale. Go ahead, Karen.
Oh, hi, Senator Slotkin. I'm Karen Teagarden, the president of Unite Women, and who also is a constituent. We've met a few times, but I understand the strategy of trying to work in a bipartisan way and maybe vote in ways that can garner support from the other side in normal times. I think we can all agree, these are definitely not normal times. Can you please address your yes votes on some of Trump's nominees who are highly unqualified? Thank you.
Sure. So thank you for the question. What she's referring to is I think some people know we've been voting on, when a new president comes in, they get to nominate people to serve in their cabinet, people to serve at senior positions in all the federal government departments and agencies. And then we have a vote in the Senate on each of those nominees. I'm not every single one, but on most of them. And it's true, I have voted for some of President Trump's nominees. In each of the cases where I voted for them, I either believed they were qualified for the job, or I felt it was really important to have a relationship with this person because of my committee that I was on, and because I am going to get calls from Michiganders, maybe some of you listening, who are going to need help from these agencies, and I need to be able to call up those leaders and have a conversation with them. Let me give you an example. Okay, last week we got a heads up, some privately passed information from a workplace in Michigan that they were about to have a cut of potentially up to 1,000 people. As you can imagine, there was like full panic going on in that government agency. And we were getting all kinds of calls, myself and Senator Peters. And we were able to call up the appropriate head of agency who we had voted for, and have a conversation with that person and say, we're hearing this, please tell us this isn't true. Can you please look into this? Can you please understand what risk this is going to create for the country, what risk this is going to create for Michigan, what economically it's going to do to our communities, et cetera. They did that, and those cuts so far have not happened. So I understand that there's a lot of people, because we get a lot of calls on this, similar to your question, that there are some people who want me to vote against every single person that President Trump puts up out of principle. I do. But I also I'm getting the calls from so many Michiganders who need help and who want me to call these people and get something moving for them. So I made the decision as someone who's very practical, that I can't just be an activist, that I have to be able to get things done when Michiganders, like last week, call me and say, please help me, please save these critically important jobs. So that's the rationale. I know it's not universally loved, but that's the straight answer on why I have voted for some of these nominees.
Okay, I'm going to take a question that we had submitted online. It's a foreign policy question from Timothy. What are your thoughts on reaching out to Russia and Iran in an effort to reduce tensions?
Yeah, well, President Trump has definitely done more than reach out to Russia, right? I think I think I've been very open about the fact that I just see the world differently than President Trump. I know America's not perfect, but man, I believe in American leadership. I think American leadership abroad keeps us safe, and I will take American leadership over Chinese leadership or Russian leadership any day of the week. But President Trump has taken a different approach, and he has done more than reach out to Russia. He has really said publicly that he's sympathetic to their position and willing to give them things, even though they invaded a neighboring democracy. So the proof will be in the pudding. If the president can make a deal, and that deal is actually durable, then we should all be for that. What I'm concerned about is that we make a deal that isn't durable, that Ukraine and Russia maybe temporarily get to a ceasefire, but Russia takes the intervening time to regroup, rearm, rest, and then the minute we go on to something else, they start taking more territory and start it over again. And they have a history of that, right? Russia invaded Georgia, the country of Georgia. Russia invaded Crimea, part of Ukraine, and took it. And then Russia, a few years later, invaded eastern Ukraine. So the proof will be in the pudding, but we need a durable deal, not a short-term deal that just favors Putin because we want to be done with that issue. On Iran, I'm watching that as well. I think my entire lifetime, I'm 48, my entire lifetime, we've had a deeply adversarial relationship with Iran. And we've tried all kinds of things. We've tried a pressure campaign, we've tried negotiating with them, We've tried all kinds of things. They've wreaked havoc in the Middle East. They've armed terrorist groups and militia groups. They've killed American citizens. They have been a thorn in our side for my entire lifetime. So I think all we can do is try, right? Particularly since they are a country that has nuclear energy and could convert that into a nuclear weapon. You always want to keep communication open. Lots of people, lots of leaders, Democrat and Republican presidents have kept communication open. But again, the proof will be in the pudding on whether we can get to some change with Iran. It would be great, but it's been a tough nut to crack for 48 years.
Okay, we're going to go back to a live call. I'm going to do Mike from Lake Orion, who has a question about insider trading. Go ahead, Mike.
Good evening, Senator. Thank you for the update today. It's really informative. During your campaign, you had said that you were going to introduce a bill to stop and prohibit insider trading by members of Congress. I'm looking for an update on that.
Yeah. So that was a bill that I introduced in the House when I was a House member. And just so everyone knows what he's talking about, it is a bill that would ban members of Congress and their spouses from trading stocks while they were members of Congress, right? And the idea goes, members of Congress get access to classified information, sensitive information. We get briefings, we get intelligence updates, we get all kinds of things that maybe the average citizen wouldn't get, ever. And we have seen that people have turned around and made decisions on what stocks to buy or sell based on potentially that information. So a bunch of us in the House, actually, Democrats and Republicans, co-sponsored legislation that would ban stock trading among members of Congress and their spouses. I still believe deeply in the work. It's controversial. There's lots of Democrats and Republicans who don't like that bill, I should just say. But we are moving forward to reintroduce it. There's a couple of versions already active in the Senate. I believe that Senator John Ossoff from Georgia has a bill that does the exact same thing. So I'll either co-sponsor his. If his isn't exactly like mine, I will reinitiate, reintroduce my own in the Senate. But that if you want to see sparks fly, start members of Congress having this conversation. It's an issue of much debate across party lines. But thank you for asking. It's a good question.
So, Senator, I'm going to ask a question that we've gotten probably from 20 different people at least easily, which is essentially, what are Democrats doing to protect Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security?
Yeah. So I think the first one to focus on is Medicaid, okay? Because in the math of the proposals that President Trump has laid out, I mean, it's in print, right? You don't have to speculate. There's almost no way to get the math to work on his proposal without at least coming after Medicaid. And we talked about how many Michiganders depend on Medicaid. And by the way, you may depend on Medicaid and not even know it. A lot of home visitor coverage for older folks who need a little bit of help, or folks with disabilities who need a little bit of help, group homes, nursing homes that maybe your mom or your dad are in. I guarantee you that whole sort of home visitor, home health coverage, it often is deeply connected to Medicaid. Right now, what our goal has to be, and this is where I'm going to need your help from the public, is exposing just what damage it would do to cut people off from their Medicaid. We need real stories, concrete stories from people in the know who can specifically talk about this and air those concerns. We need people to be speaking with their representatives, whether they're Democrat or Republican, and articulating what the loss of these Medicaid dollars would do in your community. And then for those who are willing, there are lawsuits. Like I said, our Attorney General is engaged in some lawsuits, and she needs firsthand accounts of damage done to Michiganders from some of these policies. So that's number one. Number two is the threat to Medicare and Social Security. This is like the big enchilada that I want people really paying attention to. Right now, despite President Trump saying he's not going to touch Medicare and Social Security, Elon Musk has continued to call Social Security a Ponzi scheme. He's this week, in the past week, said we have to look at these quote unquote entitlements, Medicare and Social Security. We have not seen plans on that yet, but we need to watch that space. But what you're going to see now, once we get through tomorrow and seeing whether the government stays open, you're going to see a shift to start exposing what these cuts to Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security will do. I would throw in there, watch the post office. Okay, the president floated the idea of moving the post office from where it's always been, the Postal Service. We all know the post office, and moving it to a new department, the Department of Commerce. And we are concerned about privatization of some of the Postal Service. We don't want that. No, especially our rural communities. Heck no. So we are watching all those things, but we need real life cases that we can expose in the media and expose to our colleagues here in elected office to make sure they understand that cutting Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security is going to be devastating for the average American.
Okay, now we're going to go to Debbie from Whitmore Lake, who has a question about national parks. Go ahead, Debbie.
Hi, Senator. Thank you so much for meeting with all of us and keeping us up on this, being willing to meet with us. I know so many have not been able or willing to do so. My concern is our environment. Our national parks are a treasure, and we need to preserve them. We, our net with our lakes here and everything. If I'm just very worried about them undoing the EPA and them spoiling our land here so that we have poison water and poison air and land that won't grow anything anymore. What is being done to make sure that this doesn't happen, that we have protections?
Yep. Great question. And I can't think of an issue that is more like central to Michiganders than our water, right? I mean, we are the Great Lakes state. Water is fundamental to who we are. It's our natural heritage. We all love our state. We think it's the best state in the world. And it's actually the most bipartisan issue I work on, right? Is preserving our lakes, our rivers, our watersheds, and our Great Lakes. So it's the right question. So the thing that I'm watching most closely is what you alluded to. It's obviously cutting people in the EPA. We have a lot of people who work in Michigan at the EPA and who are involved in testing our water and testing our air. So we've got to make sure that we're not just cutting and slashing people who are the ones responsible for testing our water. And certainly in Michigan, right, we know what happens when we're not watching the water closely enough, right? Flint, Michigan, everyone in the world knows what happened in Flint, Michigan, right? An apocalyptic poisoning of an American city because of water quality. So we got to make sure that we're preserving the people who do the hard work of testing our air, our water, and enforcing all that. But then what we need to watch like hawks is if there is just a decision made by the president to not enforce regulations that are on the books around clean water, right? And I understand, right? There's a lot of controversy around the issue of regulation, right? Regulation when you're trying to start a new business, or regulation when you're trying to get a patent or something like that. I understand that for a lot of people, regulations really do gum up the works. But I would argue that the president doesn't have the right to just wholesale ignore regulations that are on the books. And that is a constitutional issue. If you want to take that regulation off the books, then let's have a conversation and legislate it, right? But you can't just decide not to enforce things that former Congresses and former presidents have put into law. It is in law. So I think what we are trying to do is, first of all, this is where you guys are the canaries in the coal mine. Like we are in very close touch with the federal government employees in the state of Michigan who do this work. If regulations aren't going to be met, we need to hear from people that that's happening, and we need to expose that. Because I can't think of a single Michigander who wants to hand their child a glass of water and not know what's in it. And I can't think of a single Michigander who wants to spoil what we've preserved here in our Great Lakes. So that is, if they go into non-enforcement, that is an issue that I think would go potentially up to the highest level of the courts. But we also need to make sure that in a bipartisan basis, Michiganders are yelling and screaming, banging pots and pans. If that's the case, it shouldn't be a partisan issue protecting our water and our natural habitat. But that's the non-enforcement is the issue I'm watching, particularly on clean air and clean water.
Senator, we are going to take our last question for the night, and then after you are finished answering, you can close us out. We're going to go to Kitty from Midland, who has a question about Medicaid. Go ahead, please, Kitty.
Hello, Elissa Slotkin. I thank you for taking my call. I'm 76 years old, and I'm a nurse by trade, but had to retire because of Lyme disease. And I have, for my insurance, health insurance, both Medicare and Medicaid. And also suffer with post-traumatic stress disorder. And so it doesn't help matters. And I'm probably going to start crying because I don't know if I've ever felt threatened in my life living in the United States. And I have a voucher, voucher program, home to own, through the state of Michigan also. And I'm just so worried. I just feel like I'm in a cage or something. I probably shouldn't, but I sort of do. I don't think it's really hit me until just this last 2 days.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Well, thank you for reaching out, and I think the fear that you're feeling is a pretty common thing right now. I think that we all know there's something going on in the country, right? We know, especially living in Michigan, that, politics and what happened in Washington used to be kind of very far away. And in Michigan, we were Democrats and Republicans, but it just wasn't really a big deal. And we certainly weren't terrible with each other and nasty with each other. And we all kind of just understood that what happened when Washington was maybe on the nightly news, but it wasn't, something that made us feel scared. And now there's a lot of people across the country across the state who feel uncertain about the future. And all I can tell you is that this is not the only time in our country's history where we've had terrible, tough moments. We've had tough moments before, periods in our history where just there was a lot of uncertainty, a lot of economic concern, and we get through it. We get through it when we engage. So just by you being on a town hall and asking a live question, I applaud you for that, because that means you're engaged. It means you're trying to make things better. You want your country to succeed and get through this, and you want to push it forward. I think the best thing I can tell you is just please keep speaking up, right? Particularly given what you said, that you rely on Medicare and Medicaid. We need people who rely on these programs to be vocal with every one of their elected representatives, right? Regardless of their party, to communicate so that no one can come away thinking, oh, it's no big deal if we cut these programs. My hope is that my work is centered around the idea that in order to, the president, even though he and I don't agree on lots of things, is not looking to make an enemy of every single person on Medicare or Medicaid or Social Security. That's basically a huge chunk of the country. But we need to make that case, again, through legislation, through courts, and also through public sentiment. This is still a democracy, right? No matter how much stress is on it, no matter how many people are trying to pull at the strings of democracy, it is still a democracy, and the people still have a voice here. We need to use that. So I applaud you for asking a question. I know that was hard, And I want you to keep doing it. Keep calling everybody. Just make a couple phone calls a day. Tell your story to the local media. Put it out on Facebook if you're a Facebook user. Just be vocal. Join a group, right? It's not like you're the only one in this situation. There are people in your own community in Midland and beyond who are going through the same concerns and fear, and people need to get strength in numbers. So thank you for being engaged citizen. You have my commitment that I'm going to fight for those things that you depend on because you earned them, right? You earned them. So, okay. I think we've done with our hour here. Thank you for participating in our first teletown hall. Like I said, I know this is a really busy time for lots of people, a lot of concern from people across the country, but thank you for being active and being engaged. Please, again, press *6 to get onto our newsletter. That's the best way to keep track of like what is happening and keep me accountable as a senator. I'm going to be in Michigan next week doing lots of events related to these very things: Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, tariffs.